Hello, everybody. We're going to get started with the Cold War and John F. Kennedy's foreign policy. To set the video up for today, Kennedy followed Dwight D. Eisenhower as the next president of the United States. His foreign policy focused on the Soviet Union, which was similar to presidents before him and presidents after him. But he faced a new challenge in the Western Hemisphere. That challenge was Cuba. Vocabulary for the day, a couple of new ones: Cuban Missile Crisis and the space race. Check those out before continuing on. One of the things that's important as we make our way through this video is the geography of the United States and its relationship to Cuba. One of the things that will be discussed in the video is the Bay of Pigs. And on this map, you can see the location of the Bay of Pigs and Cuba, and then what state and thus what country is north of Cuba. That state is Florida, and thus the country is the United States. There were a number of highlights to John F. Kennedy's foreign policy over his time as president. One of the first things that he did was he created the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was designed to be a collection of volunteers, and what they would go out and do was in countries that were struggling. Oftentimes, these countries were developing nations, but behind that, these countries had been impacted by colonization. They would go into these countries and give assistance, which didn't cost a whole lot of money because they were volunteers. Often the volunteers were of college age and very young and youthful. So that's what the Peace Corps was, and it was aimed toward these developing nations. Under the Eisenhower administration, it had a plan to invade Cuba at one point. Fidel Castro was in charge of Cuba by the time John F. Kennedy came to power, but his rise to power happened during Eisenhower's administration. They thought it would be a democratic government under Castro, but that was not the case. Castro took power and became a communist, or turned the government into a communist government. This, of course, doesn't appeal to the United States during this time because of the Cold War and Cold War policies. So this was a bad thing given the time period for the United States. And Eisenhower had a plan to remove Castro. It didn't happen during Kennedy's time, it didn't happen during Eisenhower's time in office, but Kennedy, when he became president, found out about this plan and went ahead with it anyhow. It was a disaster. It didn't work out well. It's known as the Bay of Pigs. And if you go back to the map on one of the earlier slides, you'll actually see the Bay of Pigs highlighted by that map. The Bay of Pigs happened about the same time as the start of the creation of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was a very basic wall in its earliest beginnings, throwing up barbed wire fence and starting to create the divide between West Berlin and East Berlin. Over the years, the Berlin Wall becomes much more complex, from guard dogs to watchtowers to a stone wall, a cement wall with a rounded top. I mean, there are a number of things and more that were done with the Berlin Wall to prevent people from escaping from East Germany into West Berlin, and once in West Berlin, having access to Western Europe. The Berlin Wall really does go to show that in West Berlin versus East Berlin, that comparison of the two areas, there was more economic success and people found themselves better off in West Berlin, which is why it was very attractive to people, which is why it was closed off. West Berlin was eventually closed off. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the height of tensions in the Cold War. This happened in 1962, in late 1962. This is again attached to the Cuban Communist government under Fidel Castro. What happened was the Soviet Union was interested in placing missiles in communist Cuba, and it made sense for the Soviets to put missiles there because now they would have the United States within range of their missiles. So the missiles were sent. They were found out by a U-2 plane and pictures. And once that was discovered, there was a standoff between the two nations, and both sides really did think that this could lead to nuclear war. If we take a look at this map, you'll see what is listed in blue as NATO, and then what is listed in that peachish color with the Warsaw Pact. And you'll notice in Turkey, there is a missile base, and that missile base is a United States controlled missile base. And what that allows for is the United States to attack with nuclear missiles many locations in the Soviet Union and countries part of the Warsaw Pact. This is why the Soviet Union found it so beneficial to have missiles in Cuba. It's because those missiles were then very much in range of the United States and many locations in the United States. Finally, John F. Kennedy's New Frontier program. The space race was ongoing prior to JFK's ascendancy into the presidency, but Kennedy took it to another level. The idea of the New Frontier had one clear-cut main goal, and that was to put a man on the moon, and to do so ahead of the Soviet Union. We've already heard how Sputnik, the first satellite launched into space, was sent by the Soviet Union, and Kennedy puts his own stamp on the space race here, saying we are going to put a man on the moon ahead of the Soviet Union, and that will happen close to a decade later. 1969 is the launch date there. That's it, everybody. Have a good one.